This guy's one of the worst teammates you could possibly have.
This is nothing new for this Brooklyn Nets team.
He said, oh, I'll be here forever if you'll have me. And then an hour later, he said, I don't want to be here and I'm going to leave.
Another day, another controversy. When it comes to absolute dysfunction, the Nets are truly in a tier of their own. Since the end of last season, we've seen trade demands, ultimatums, injuries, hate speech, and everything in between. And it's only February. I think we've gotten numb to all the chaos that surrounds the Nets organization, so today I'm going to look back and chronicle everything that's happened since last summer, so we can see how this has truly been the wildest roller coaster ride in NBA and maybe sports history. So this whole mess starts off with none other than Kyrie Irving. On June 20th, Shams reported that he and the Nets were at an impasse when discussing plans for the future and that he may be available for a trade. Since Kevin Durant was buddies with Kyrie, it was then reported that he was monitoring the situation closely and was weighing his options for the future. This was the first time in the offseason where it seemed like there was a real chance that both KD and Kyrie could be playing for different teams by the start of next season. Everybody was firing up the trade machines and working on their jersey photoshops. But then seemingly out of nowhere, Kyrie Irving picked up his player option on June 27th, meaning that he was going to be back in Brooklyn for 2023. With Kyrie coming back, the Nets can finally breathe because this means that KD has no reason to leave, right?
Nope.
Little did we know, the fun was just getting started. On June 30th, right before free agency opened up, Durant requested a trade from Brooklyn. With 4 years left on his contract, KD was probably the most valuable asset the trade market had ever seen, which led us to believe that there was going to be a massive bidding war for his services and that a deal would be done sooner rather than later. But since the Rudy Gobert trade inflated the market, Brooklyn's asking price was simply too high and nothing serious ever materialized. This is when it got really toxic. After a couple months of relative silence, it was leaked to the press that Durant told Nets owner Joe Tsai that he would only come back to Brooklyn if he fired GM Sean Marks and head coach Steve Nash. This left all of us on our toes because it was a true test to see how much power star players really have over an organization. For some context, KD and Kyrie both vouched for Steve Nash over more experienced coaches, and Marks brought in whoever the two wanted as their supporting cast. If Tsai caved and gave in to Durant's demands, it would have set a new precedent regarding what players have control over, and likely would have led to some brutal debates during the upcoming collective bargaining negotiations. But thankfully for the sake of the league, Tsai had diamond hands and held firm. A few weeks later, the Nets released a statement saying that Nash, Tsai, Marks, and Durant all met up, made amends, and that they would all be moving forward together. So despite Kyrie entering the offseason with one foot out the door, Durant demanding that he wanted out, and it publicly being known that he didn't want to work with Marks or Nash, all four of them would be running it back to start the season like nothing ever happened. On top of this, they were adding Ben Simmons, one of the most scrutinized players in recent NBA history, to the mix, as he was finally healthy enough to play for the first time in about a year and a half. What could possibly go wrong? Unsurprisingly, things got off to a bit of a rocky start. The team started the season at an underwhelming 1-3, and a few hours before their fifth game, Kyrie decided to tweet out a link to a documentary with a bunch of anti-Semitic conspiracies. From there, Joe Tsai publicly stated his displeasure with Kyrie's tweet, and despite seemingly the entire world against him, Kyrie initially refused to take down the tweet, and actually doubled down on why it in fact wasn't anti-Semitic during a post-game press conference.
Another human being. I can post whatever I want, so say that and shut it down and move on to the next question.
Following his decision to stand firm on what he did, Kanye West, who was in the midst of an anti-Semitic tirade himself, publicly endorsed Irving, which was not a good look. After withholding him from the media for a few days, the Nets seem to have finally gotten through to Kyrie, and he apologized for sharing the documentary. When talking to the press, a softball question was given to him asking if he had any anti-Semitic beliefs, and instead of saying no and just moving on from this whole mess, he danced around the question, leading to the Nets suspending him for 8 games. While all of this was happening, there was another disaster brewing at the same time. Steve Nash was not working as the head coach. They lost to Indiana to drop to 1-5, and Nash was firmly on the hot seat. They got their revenge by beating the Pacers in a rematch 2 nights later, and then they decided to fire Steve Nash. Waiting to fire him after a victory was funny enough, but what was even funnier was their plan to replace him. As if Brooklyn didn't have enough bad press at the time, it was reported that a deal was being finalized to bring in Ime Udoka, of all people, to be their next head coach. In a vacuum, this honestly made a ton of sense. Udoka was familiar with Brooklyn as he was an assistant there in 2021, and he just took the Celtics to the finals in his first year as a head coach. But then you have to remember why he in fact was available. Right before training camp, the Celtics suspended Ime for the entire season due to an alleged affair that he had with a female member of the Celtics organization. This was quite literally the most tone-deaf move that they could have possibly made. But after a holdup in the investigation process with Udoka and a ton of public backlash, Brooklyn decided to pivot and name Vaughn their new head coach. Nobody really knew what to make of him since he was unproven as a head coach, but things changed immediately after he took over. The vibe around the team was just so much better as he seemed to connect with the guys in the locker room in a way that Nash never could. It was most apparent on the defensive side of the ball. With Nash running the show, Brooklyn statistically had the second worst defense in the entire league. But once Vaughn took over, they implemented a new system where they switched everything and relied heavily on Durant and Claxton protecting the rim. This transformed the identity of the team and helped keep them afloat while Kyrie Irving was suspended, going 5-3 during that stretch. On November 8th, Irving's suspension was over and he rejoined the Nets lineup. It took him a few games to get acclimated into Vaughn's new system, but after about a week with most of their roster being healthy, the Nets really took off. From late November to early January, the Nets were the best team in basketball. During that stretch, they went 18-2 and also had a 12-game winning streak in the process. This was the absolute best we've ever seen Durant and Kyrie play together. Kyrie was putting up an extremely well-rounded 26, 5-5 while being the NBA's leading fourth quarter scorer. On top of that, he was on his best behavior and staying out of the headlines, which felt like the first time in forever. As for Durant, he re-entered his name into the best player in the world conversation during this time. On top of leading the team's turnaround on the defensive end like I already mentioned, he averaged 30, 7, and 5 on insane 58, 42, 96 shooting splits during this stretch. In terms of all-around dominance on both sides of the ball, it was probably the best we've ever seen him play. But on top of Kyrie and KD's greatness, the entire supporting cast was thriving in their respective roles. Yuta Watanabe was one of the most accurate three-point shooters in the league, Nick Claxton was in Defensive Player of the Year conversations, and even the unproven Vaughn won Eastern Conference Coach of the Month for December. Just like that, we began to forget about all of the noise that surrounded this team for the previous 6 months. Once again, we were starting to view them as a legitimate title contender. Everything was clicking, and it seemed like they were going to be a force going forward. But on January 8th, Jimmy Butler accidentally fell into Kevin Durant's knee and he sprained his MCL. Thankfully, this injury wasn't as severe as people expected, but he was scheduled to miss about a month. This was so frightening because he suffered the same exact injury in January of last year, and it completely derailed the Nets season. Once he got hurt in early 2022, Brooklyn ended up losing 11 straight, James Harden demanded a trade, and they completely fell out of contention. At first, it looked like we might see a repeat of last year, as they lost their first 4 games in a row post-KD injury. Everybody started holding their breath, but then Kyrie Irving started to play some amazing basketball to drag his team to a few wins. Even though they were just 4-7 without Durant, there was plenty of optimism surrounding this team. They were doing just enough to stay afloat in the East, and their superstar was scheduled to return very soon. All that they had to do was get him back on the court with Kyrie, and Brooklyn would go right back to being the powerhouse that they were in December. But then on February 3rd, Kyrie Irving demanded a trade. While this seemed like it just came out of nowhere, Kyrie and the Nets front office were quietly negotiating a deal for a contract extension behind the scenes. Due to all the extracurriculars that kept him off the court during his time there, Sean Marks didn't want to give him a fully guaranteed deal and gave him one that was incentives-based, being heavily tied to the Nets winning a championship. This left Irving disgusted, and he immediately demanded out. Marks and Size seemed to be fed up with their mercurial point guard and found a trade with the Mavericks for him just 2 days later. Even though the Nets got a couple of nice pieces in the deal, it was clear that this team no longer had the championship ceiling that it did pre-trade. Knowing that he didn't even really want to be there coming into the season, all eyes shifted to Kevin Durant to see whether he would request a trade or not. This was so interesting because even if he did, it was going to be super difficult to find a proper package for him just a few days before the trade deadline. So putting something together on this short notice seemed very unlikely. And for the next few days, we didn't really hear much of anything. Durant was still out rehabbing his injury, so he wasn't available to the media, and there were no reports of any deals being seriously discussed. So all signs pointed to the fact that KD was probably going to end up being in Brooklyn for the rest of the season. But if this video has taught you anything, you should expect the unexpected when it comes to the Nets. Just 14 hours before the deadline, Brooklyn traded Kevin Durant to the Phoenix Suns in exchange for Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Jay Crowder, and a haul of draft picks. Even though there's still about 28 games remaining, this effectively ended the crazy ride that was the Nets season. They are clearly in rebuild mode, as they have swiftly shut the door on the KD-Kyrie era with these 2 moves. Maybe Cam Thomas will continue dropping 40 a night and lead them to a championship, but it really looks like it's wraps from here. Now that everything is seemingly settled, I think it's safe to say that we have never seen a team have as many highs and lows in such a short time span. They unsuccessfully tried to blow this team up over the summer, came into the season looking horrible, and then became a legitimate championship contender seemingly overnight. But in the span of a few days, they blew that up and are now in a full rebuild. If it sounds like a lot, that's because it is. I have no idea what's going to happen to this team next, but at this point, nothing surprises me when it comes to the Brooklyn Nets. Let me know in the comments if you think this year's Nets squad is the most dysfunctional team ever. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out some of the other content on my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.